My in-laws were drunk at the wedding, but they did not care. Even though people were whispering about them, they started yelling at me. It is too late now that you are married, but if you want to be part of this family, you need to show us. You have enough money, they said. Yes, your dad is right, so make sure to give us $16,000 a month. As a new bonus, they added. I was shocked by their demands. I could not believe they would say such things at my wedding reception. I just stared at them. Feeling my face go pale, my dad took the microphone from them. Have you ever been blindsided by a family member's greed, right when you were supposed to be celebrating? Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. My father, Thomas, did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He stood there, with the poise of a man who had spent 30 years looking down from a high court bench. A man whose silence carried more weight than their drunken shouting ever could. I watched his knuckles whiten around the microphone, the only sign of the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. He looked at Jennifer and Gary, not with anger, but with the same clinical disappointment he used for a particularly poorly argued case. For a second, the Manhattan penthouse went silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant siren of an ambulance on the street below. I stood there in my custom silk gown, the lace itching against my skin, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. This was supposed to be the start of my life, but looking at my mother-in-law's smirking, flushed face, it felt more like an audit. Jennifer reached out, trying to snatch the microphone back, her expensive jewelry clinking like tiny glass shards. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that set my teeth on edge, and leaned in close enough for me to smell the expensive gin on her breath. She told my father to lighten up, that we were all family now, and that family looked after each other's interests. But as she spoke, her eyes stayed fixed on me, cold and calculating. She started talking about Ethan, about how he was their treasure, their legacy, and how a woman like me should be grateful to even stand in the shadow of their name. She leaned in even closer, whispering that my title as a senior software architect was just a nice hobby, but it was time to put that high-end salary to actual use for the family that had welcomed me. I looked over at Ethan, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for him to step in. I was waiting for the man who had promised to be my fortress. The man who had spent a year convincing me that my heart was safe with him. But Ethan did not move. He stood there, adjusting his cufflinks, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the guests' heads. He looked perfectly polished, and completely hollow. It was then that the first crack appeared in my version of reality. I realized that my initial silence was not just shock. It was a survival instinct I had honed over years of building my own success from nothing. It felt like a house of cards was collapsing in slow motion. I had spent my entire career designing systems that were logical, secure, and resilient. I had built the Aegis architecture to be a fortress against bad data and external threats. And yet, I had let this family walk right through the front door of my life without a single security check. I realized that I had been living in a cage I thought was gold, but was really just painted iron. I had been so desperate for the warmth of a full family, something I had lacked since I lost my mother, that I ignored the cold iron bars being forged around me. This was the invisible chain of a survivor. I had been so focused on thriving and proving I was enough that I had accidentally made myself the perfect target for people who only saw value in what they could take. Jennifer's hand brushed against my arm, and I flinched. It was not a touch of affection, it was a touch of ownership. She told me to be sensible, to stop making a scene, and to think about the contract we had discussed. She called it a test of my devotion. She made it sound so normal, so necessary, like I was the one being unreasonable for wanting to keep the money I had worked 80-hour weeks to earn. I felt the suite closing in on me, the luxury of Manhattan suddenly feeling like a very expensive prison cell. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just looked at the exit and realized that the only person who was going to save me was the woman who had built everything she owned with her own 2 hands. Ethan walked into the bridal suite 2 minutes after his mother left. He did not come to apologize. He did not come to check if I was okay. He walked in and checked his reflection in the full-length mirror, adjusting the same tie I had picked out for him 3 months ago. The scent of his cologne, which used to feel like home, now felt like a chemical signature on a predatory loan. He looked at me through the reflection and said that I was being difficult. He told me that my reaction in the hallway was embarrassing to him and that his mother was only trying to ensure our future was secure. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. He spoke with a calm, practiced tone, the kind he used to land high-level marketing accounts. He told me that I was clearly exhausted from the wedding planning and that my stress was causing me to hallucinate malice where there was only tradition. He said that in Manhattan, family was a brand, and a brand required investment. He described the $16,000 a month not as a theft, but as a subscription to a lifestyle I was lucky to be part of. He actually said that I should view it as a management fee for the social capital his parents provided. Then came the knife in the dark. He leaned against the mahogany doorframe and told me that Jennifer was worried about my mental state. He said she had already been forced to tell our guests that I was having a minor breakdown due to the pressure. I realized then that while I was in here trying to find my breath, Jennifer was out there poisoning the well. She was running a whisper campaign, turning my shock into a symptom of instability. If I complained now, I was just a hysterical bride. If I fought back, I was proving her right. It was a perfect, circular trap designed to isolate me until I had no choice but to sign that contract for the sake of my own reputation. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. I watched Ethan and realized that to him, this was not a betrayal. To his family, the exploitation of an outsider was just a standard business practice. They had spent decades treating people as assets to be depreciated and discarded. They were not shocked by what they were doing to me. They were truly, genuinely shocked that I was not complying with the audit. In their world, empathy was a liability, and greed was a legacy. They had normalized this behavior for so long that they no longer saw the blood on their hands. They only saw the profit on the balance sheet. I stood by the window and looked out at the city skyline, but I was really looking at the numbers in my head. I thought about my architectural designs, the logic gates, the fail-safes. My entire life was built on the principle that if a system is compromised, you do not try to fix it while it is running. You shut it down. You isolate the threat. You purge the corrupted data. Ethan asked me if I was listening. He told me that the band was waiting for our first dance and that I needed to fix my makeup and get back out there. He said that if I signed the papers now, we could forget this ever happened and start our life. I realized then that the golden cage was not just built on his parents' greed, it was built on Ethan's cowardice. He needed my salary to maintain the illusion of his own success because his parents were drowning in debt. The penthouse, the gala, the champagne, it was all a house of cards, and I was the foundation they were planning to bury alive. I looked at him and felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I did not belong here. I was not a line item in their recovery plan. I was the architect of my own exit. I walked out of that penthouse without looking back once. The elevator ride down felt like a system reset. As the floor numbers ticked down, I could feel the weight of that $16,000 a month demand falling away, replaced by the cold, hard logic of a software architect. The Manhattan air hit my face, sharp and unforgiving, smelling of rain and exhaust. I did not call a cab to go back to the apartment I shared with Ethan. That place was a compromised server. I went to the only place where the truth was still a protected asset. My father's study in Brooklyn. The room smelled of old leather, cedar, and the silent weight of 1,000 law books. Thomas did not offer me a hug or a glass of water when I walked in, still wearing a wedding dress that now felt like a funeral shroud. He just looked at my face, saw the clinical distance in my eyes, and nodded. He knew. He had spent his life reading people from a high court bench, and he could see that I had finally performed a forced shutdown on my own delusions. I sat across from his mahogany desk, the ivory silk of my skirt spilling onto the Persian rug, and told him about the contract. I told him about the $16,000, the annual bonus, and the whisper campaign Jennifer was already running against me. Thomas did not look surprised. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. He told me that emotion is just bad data in a critical audit, and it was time we looked at the actual balance sheet of the family I had almost joined. For the last few months, his judicial instincts had been screaming, and he had been doing what he did best, gathering evidence. We did not talk about my broken heart, we talked about Gary's liabilities. As we went through the documents, the scale of the deception became clear. Gary's prestigious consulting firm was a ghost. It was a hollow shell, a front designed to maintain the appearance of Manhattan royalty while the bank accounts were bleeding out. My father showed me the public records he had pulled through his connections. Gary had not landed a major client in 3 years. They were not wealthy, they were professional debtors. Then we found the true motive behind the salary ransom. The Manhattan penthouse, the one where the party was still happening, was facing immediate foreclosure. The bank had issued a final warning 6 weeks ago. Jennifer and Gary were not looking for a family bonus. They were looking for a bridge loan that never had to be repaid. My $16,000 a month was the exact amount needed to cover the delinquent mortgage payments and property taxes to keep the lights on for another month. They were not welcoming me into a family. They were recruiting a silent investor to liquidate my own future to save their sinking ship. I stared at the numbers on the page, feeling a sense of enlightenment that had nothing to do with peace. This was not a breakdown, it was an audit. I realized that every "I love you" from Ethan, every warm smile from Jennifer had been a calculated attempt to increase their credit limit. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrawn for years. I looked at my father, and for the first time that day, I felt powerful. I told him I wanted a full forensic audit of everything Gary had touched during our engagement. If they were going to treat my life like a business transaction, I was going to make sure they knew exactly what happens when a contract is breached. I took out my phone and blocked Ethan's number. The system was now officially offline. The grandfather clock in my father's study ticked with a heavy, rhythmic finality that matched the beating of my heart. We had been sitting there for 3 hours, the silence between us only broken by the crisp sound of turning pages and the scratching of my father's fountain pen. Thomas was in his element. He was no longer just my father. He was the Honorable Judge Thomas, presiding over the total collapse of my former life. He did not look up when the forensic accountant's report arrived in his inbox. He simply printed it and slid the final page across the mahogany desk toward me. I picked it up with hands that had finally stopped shaking. I scanned the lines of data, the logic of the numbers cutting through the emotional fog like a high-powered laser. Then, I saw it. The kill shot. Gary had not just been waiting for my $16,000 a month salary to save his penthouse. He had started the harvest months ago. I stared at a copy of a high-interest bridge loan for $250,000. The borrower's name at the bottom was mine. The signature was a near-perfect replica of my own, but the loop of the "ye" in Yara was just a fraction too wide. It was a performance of my life by a man who viewed me as nothing more than a high-yield asset. Gary had used the detailed background check information and financial statements I had provided for our prenuptial vetting. I had handed him the keys to my identity because I thought we were building a union. Instead, he had used that data to forge my signature on a predatory loan to cover his firm's massive losses. This was not just greed or a family misunderstanding. This was a systematic identity harvest. They did not just want my money. They wanted to liquefy my entire future and pour it into their black hole of debt. I felt a final, cold snap in my chest. That last thread of family duty I had been clinging to did not just break, it evaporated. I realized that Jennifer, Gary, and even Ethan were not family members I had disappointed. They were a sophisticated security threat that had breached my internal servers. They had mapped my vulnerabilities, my desire for belonging, my respect for elders, and used them to install a virus designed to drain my life's work. I looked at my father. He was watching me with an expression that was almost proud, the way an architect looks at a bridge that has survived its first hurricane. He asked me what I wanted to do. In the past, I might have asked how we could resolve this quietly to save their reputation. I might have worried about Ethan's career. But those thoughts were legacy data. They were irrelevant. I told him that I no longer saw them as family. I saw them as a security breach that needed to be patched, permanently. Gary had committed a felony. He had not just asked for a loan, he had stolen my identity to commit fraud. I felt a crystalline clarity settle over me. This was not a tragedy anymore. It was a recovery operation. I told my father to file the criminal complaint. I did not want a civil settlement. I did not want an apology. I wanted a full system purge. I took out my phone and looked at the blocked messages from Ethan. They were just bad code now. I deleted the entire conversation thread without reading it. I was no longer a bride waiting to be saved. I was the architect, and it was time to rebuild the fortress. The Manhattan Heritage Gala was exactly what I expected. The grand ballroom was a masterclass in artificial perfection, filled with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Jennifer stood in the center of a circle of board members and donors, her smile as fixed and brittle as a porcelain mask. She was performing the role of the elegant matriarch, her silk gown shimmering under the weight of a dozen crystal chandeliers. But beneath the surface, I knew the foundation was rotting. The penthouse where the party was being held was a ghost, a hollow monument to a fortune that no longer existed. I did not arrive in the ivory silk of a bride. I stepped into that ballroom wearing a charcoal power suit, my hair pulled back with a precision that signaled the end of the performance. I did not offer a smile or a tear. I offered an audit. As I moved through the crowd, the whispers Jennifer had started the lies about my mental breakdown died in the throats of the guests. They did not see a hysterical woman. They saw the senior software architect of their own downfall. Jennifer saw me and her face shifted from a practiced grin to a snarl. She started to speak, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension, telling me that I had embarrassed the family long enough and that I should leave before security was called. I did not respond with anger. Anger is a variable I had already purged from the equation. I simply walked up to her, pulled a thick manila folder from my bag, and set it on the table between two crystal vases. I told her I was not there for an apology. I was there to deliver a notice of breach. I watched her hands tremble as she opened the folder. Inside was the evidence Gary and Ethan thought was hidden, the forensic proof of the signature forgery on the $250,000 loan, and the official notice of sale from the bank. The penthouse was being seized in 48 hours. Their rented status was officially insolvent. Jennifer's composure did not just crack, it shattered. She realized the audience was not just her social circle anymore. It was a room full of witnesses to her family's criminal decay. She fell to her knees, her silk skirt catching on the edge of the table, and began to beg. She talked about family blood and legacy, about how we could fix this if I would just use my salary to cover the immediate debt. I looked down at her and realized that sometimes, the greatest liberation is not forgiveness, it is the total, clinical severance from people who view your compassion as a resource to be overdrafted. This was the moment I chose to buong ba hiwet tung de tim lai chin min. I understood that cutting a toxic tie, even one tied by marriage or history, was not an act of betrayal, it was an act of reclamation. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, making myself small so they could feel grand. I was done being the foundation for a house of cards. I did not say a word as she wept. I did not need to. My silence was the final judgment, a period at the end of a long, expensive sentence. I turned my back on her and walked toward the exit, my steps steady on the polished floor. In my mind, I was already deleting the legacy data of my life with Ethan. I was no longer a victim of their ransom. I was the architect of my own peace. I stood on the sidewalk across from the Manhattan penthouse, watching the bank-appointed movers carry out the last pieces of a life I almost lived. The crystal chandeliers were gone, replaced by empty sockets that looked like hollow eyes. Gary and Jennifer were not there. They were already settling into a small, one-bedroom rental in a part of town they used to mock. They had been stripped of their rented status, left with only the debt they had spent decades accumulating. Looking at them, I finally understood the illusion of power that comes with an empty wallet. Their entire identity had been a house of cards, built on the appearance of wealth rather than the substance of character. In their world, they had functioned on the principle of having versus being. As long as they had the penthouse and the gala invites, they believed they were superior. But wealth is not just a balance sheet, it is a foundation. When the money vanished, they did not just lose their home, they lost themselves. They had no internal value to stand on. Their status was a costume they could no longer afford to rent, and without it, they were just two strangers drowning in the consequences of their own choices. Ethan did not fare much better. The reputational stain of the forgery case was a virus that his marketing firm could not ignore. He was fired 2 weeks after the wedding ceremony collapsed. I heard he tried to reach out to his old elite contacts, but they were already deleting his data. In their world, You are only as valuable as your next high-yield connection, and Ethan had become a liability. As for me, I did not spend my $16,000 a month salary on a new penthouse. I moved back to Brooklyn and used my savings to launch the Aegis Foundation. It is a system designed to provide financial literacy and legal protection for women facing economic coercion. I am no longer just building software, I am building fortresses for the vulnerable. I am using my architectural skills to ensure that no other woman is ever held for ransom by the people who claim to love her. That first night in my new office, surrounded by the quiet hum of servers and the smell of fresh ink on legal documents, I slept through until morning. For the first time in years, the weight of the golden cage was gone. I was no longer an investment, I was the architect. To you, the person listening to this who has always felt like the invisible one, the person always standing at the edge of the family circle, this is for you. Maybe you have spent your life trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant to hold you. Maybe you have been the one people only call when they need a loan or a favor. I want you to know that your value is not a variable to be calculated by someone else's greed. You are not a line item. You are the architect of your own story. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk out of the room where you are not respected and build your own. If you've ever found the strength to say no to someone who only valued your bank account, share your story below. You might just be the sign someone else is waiting for. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice.